This tutorial explains how to configure workflow to integrate a process in Polarium. There are four main steps. Define your project's work item types. Define the statuses your work items of all types can have. Define the actions that transition work items to different statuses. And define what transitions there can be between each of the statuses. This will take a little time to show you, so let's get started. Workflow depends on work item types defined in the project configuration in the Enumerations topic under Work Items in the Project Administration, in this file, which you can edit online. Default types are provided by project templates. You can modify terminology, icons, and add or remove types. Default workflow configuration is provided by the project's template. You can customize it in the Workflow topic under Work Items in Project Administration. There may be a project-level default configuration applicable to all work item types, and most templates provide workflows for one or more work item types. Let's look at this one for a requirement. Here's a typical set of statuses for a requirement. You can modify terminology, icons, or add or remove statuses to suit the artifact type and your process. Statuses are usually adjectives that describe the current state of the work item. It's important to define the initial status, the one applied to new work items of this type. Next, you need to define all the actions that users can take to transition this type of work item from one status to another. Actions are generally verbs, which in effect tell users, you can do this. Note that you can require a user who changes the status via the action to have some role, and/or fill in some fields. You can specify some fields to be cleared of any existing value by this action. For example, if the item enters the reopen status, any value in resolution is cleared. You can also specify some conditions and functions, an advanced configuration topic that's really outside the scope of this introduction. The online help provides more information on this. Finally, you apply one or more actions to each status to transition the work item to a different status. The basic idea is to go row by row, left to right. The row represents the work item in the status named, draft for example. Intersections represent a transition from the status named on the row, draft in this case, to the status named in the intersecting column. There can be no transition from draft to draft status, so we set no action. Makes sense. But our process does allow transition from draft to awaiting review status, so we set the send to review action where the two statuses intersect in the designer. Since that's the only transition that our process allows from the draft status, we're done with that one. Going to the next status, awaiting review, and again working across the columns, we decide where our process allows transitioning between the status named on the row and the statuses named in the columns. Our process allows no transition from the awaiting review status to draft, or to itself, which would never make sense. But we would want a user to be able to transition the work item to the reviewed status, meaning that it awaits approval. The Submit for Approval action does that, so we specify it where awaiting review intersects with reviewed. Is there any other transition the process allows when the work item has awaiting review status? Yes. Our process also allows a user to set rejected status. So we set the reject action, which will transition the work item to that status. So, to review. From any status named on a row, you must decide if your process allows a transition to the status named in the intersecting column, and if so, specify the action that transitions the work item from the status named on the row to the status named on the intersecting column. Remember that you can allow more than one transition if that's what works in your process. Keep in mind too that your actions can change field values and properties, like making a field required, or clearing or setting a value in a field. Let's see the result of our workflow configuration for end users in the project. Here's a new requirement. It initially has draft status because that's what we specified as the initial status for new work items. The only action available is Send to Review, because that was the only transition specified for draft status in the workflow configuration. When we invoke the workflow action and save the item, It gets the awaiting review status as we specified in the configuration. Let's briefly look at the rest of the process as controlled by our workflow. The item in awaiting review status has two possible actions: submit for approval and reject. Remember how we set that? And notice that the user simply cannot go outside the process and do something else with this requirement. That's the case with every step in the process. So let's submit for approval. The item is now reviewed, and the person responsible for approving it can either approve it or reject it. He or she doesn't need to know the whole process, only what the next steps are. Of course, different users are most likely doing these steps at different points in the process. If we go on to the next step and save, remember how the configuration set some fields as required? Workflow prevented us from forgetting to provide required values, so our project data remains accurate all the way. Workflow control extends through the entire process until the item gets to the end. But the end state is not necessarily cast in concrete. If things change, the item can be reopened and start through the process again. We hope this brief tutorial will get you going with customizing workflows and integrating your process in Polarion. If you have any questions or comments, please let us know at info@polarion.com.